Dead Sea Scrolls prove the Book of Mormon is true. No, debunked. The YouTube creator known as Rise Zion, or Seth, claims that ancient manuscripts like the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint validate the Book of Mormon as an authentic ancient text. In this rebuttal, I'm not attacking Seth, the host of Rise Zion, personally. My aim is to carefully examine and refute the claims he presents, using evidence, historical context, and critical scholarship. I will start each section off reviewing his claim, then making a rebuttal to it. Part 1. The claim. The Book of Mormon aligns with ancient Isaiah texts unavailable to Joseph Smith in 1829. Apologists argue that when Joseph Smith included long excerpts of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon, particularly in 2 Nephi, he somehow reproduced readings that align more closely with ancient texts like the Dead Sea Scrolls, DSS, and Septuagint, LXX, than with the King James Version, KJV. These sources were not widely accessible in Smith's day, leading defenders to suggest this is evidence of supernatural translation. The implication is that Smith couldn't have guessed or fabricated these kinds of alignments, and must have been using an ancient source text, presumably from the brass plates mentioned in the Book of Mormon narrative. The rebuttal. The claim that the Book of Mormon's Isaiah passages align with the Septuagint or Dead Sea Scrolls due to divine revelation collapses under historical scrutiny. Biblical commentaries and dictionaries circulating in the early 1800s frequently addressed textual variants between the Masoretic text used in the KJV, the Septuagint, and the Latin Vulgate. By the late 18th century, comparing these sources was already standard practice among scholars and clergy. Joseph Smith, with his intense interest in religious topics, would hardly have been isolated from such discourse, either through direct access or through educated contacts. Crucially, Hyrum Smith attended Dartmouth College, a respected institution where students studied Greek, Latin, and biblical texts in both original languages and translation. It is more than likely that Hyrum was exposed to discussions about textual variants, including references to the Septuagint, Vulgate, and even the Samaritan Pentateuch. Suggesting that Joseph had no access to these ideas ignores the strong possibility that Hyrum, or others like him, served as a conduit for such knowledge. The first English translation of the Septuagint, published in 1808 by Charles Thomson, Secretary of the Continental Congress, was printed in Philadelphia and made this important biblical source available to American readers. Its existence undermines any claim that Joseph Smith couldn't have encountered these texts or interpretations by the time he began work on the Book of Mormon. Perhaps the most devastating blow to the supernatural claim is Adam Clarke's commentary, published between 1810 and 1826. Clarke's work, widely read by clergy and laypeople alike, included detailed notes on biblical textual variants. We have direct evidence that Joseph Smith had access to this commentary. Emma's cousin owned a copy and later lent it to Joseph in exchange for a favor. With Clarke's work fully published before Joseph began dictating the Book of Mormon in 1827, the timeline aligns perfectly for Smith to have incorporated those insights. In short, attributing the Book of Mormon's biblical parallels to divine intervention willfully ignores the intellectual and theological environment of the early 19th century, a world Joseph Smith and those around him were very much a part of. 2. Claim. John Tvetnes identified 234 unique Isaiah variants in the Book of Mormon that differ from the KJV. John Tvetnes, a former FARMS, Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies, scholar, analyzed Isaiah chapters in the Book of Mormon and claimed they contain 234 distinct textual variants when compared to the KJV. These variants are said to often agree with readings found in either the DSS or the LXX, suggesting that the Book of Mormon represents a more ancient or original form of Isaiah. This is used as a cumulative argument that Joseph Smith was not copying the KJV mindlessly, and that he was somehow restoring ancient lost elements of the Isaiah text. Rebuttal. I won't go too deep here, as this ties directly into Claimer 3, where our focus truly belongs. What needs to be clarified now is this. Seth isn't wrong when he says that John Tvetnes identified 234 unique Isaiah variants in the Book of Mormon. That much is true. But what Seth conveniently leaves out is far more important. Tvetnes never specifies where these variants are found. That omission is critical. Without clear citations or contextual analysis, the claim becomes little more than a vague statistic used to impress rather than inform. We'll dissect this more thoroughly in claim number 3. Claim: the Book of Mormon corrects known KJV translation or transmission errors. Several examples are given where the Book of Mormon seems to correct issues in the KJV by aligning with earlier Hebrew sources or parallel biblical passages. For instance, in 2 Nephi 12:16, the Book of Mormon includes both halves of a verse found separately in the Septuagint and Masoretic text, while the KJV includes only one. In 2 Nephi 7:2, the wording more closely matches Hebrew idioms and better conveys the metaphorical tone, supposedly aligning with the original Hebrew intent. In 2 Nephi 19:1, the Book of Mormon matches the Dead Sea Scrolls and Masoretic text placement and wording, while the KJV misplaces the verse and changes phrases. This pattern is presented as consistent and intentional, not random, bolstering the claim that the Book of Mormon restores more ancient or accurate textual forms. Rebuttal: this is a serious problem, one the Mormon Church can't explain away. They've been caught with their hand deep in the cookie jar, and there's no pulling it back out. At least 9 sections of the Book of Mormon contain content from what scholars call Deutero-Isaiah, chapters written during or after the Babylonian exile, well after 600 BCE, the year Lehi and his family supposedly fled Jerusalem. Here's the issue. Deutero-Isaiah includes material that wouldn't have existed at the time Lehi allegedly left. The Babylonian exile didn't begin until the early 500s BCE, after Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed Jerusalem and Solomon's temple, deporting much of Judah's population. So how does post-exilic scripture show up in a record that was supposedly taken from pre-exilic Jerusalem? This isn't a minor oversight, it's a glaring anachronism. The presence of Deutero-Isaiah in the Book of Mormon directly contradicts its own timeline and exposes yet another layer of historical fiction dressed up as ancient scripture. Some examples are Deutero-Isaiah, which is Isaiah 40:55, found within the Book of Mormon, Isaiah chapter to the Book of Mormon, Isaiah 48:1 Nephi 20 direct quotation, Isaiah 49:1 Nephi 21 direct quotation, Isaiah 50, 2 Nephi 7 direct quotation, Isaiah 51 Nephi 8 direct quotation, Isaiah 52:1, Mosiah 12:21, 3 Nephi 20:36 quoted, Isaiah 52:7-10, Mosiah 12:21-24, 15:14-31, 3 Nephi 20 or 40, heavily quoted, Isaiah 50:53 direct quotation, Isaiah 54 3 Nephi 22 direct quotation, Isaiah 55 quoted loosely in 2 Nephi 9 and others alluded to. Yes, it's true that the compilers of the King James Bible did not have access to the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they absolutely had access to the Septuagint, and they used it. Irish theologian and Anglican priest Alistair McGrath, in his well-researched book In the Beginning, The Story of the King James Bible and How It Changed a Nation, a Language and a Culture, makes it clear. The King James translators did not begin with blank sheets of paper in front of them. They were aware and respectful of the long line of English translators in which they stood. This was not some isolated or doctrinaire effort. These translators were thoughtful, strategic, and selective in their work. McGrath continued, the translators also avoided what, at least to them, seemed a wooden and dogmatic approach to translation, which dictated that precisely the same English words should regularly be used to translate Greek or Hebrew words. The preface sets out clearly the view that the translators saw themselves as free to use a variety of English terms. In other words, these men were not bound to a single source text or rigid methodology. They drew from a range of sources, including the Septuagint, when it suited their purposes and aligned with doctrinal or linguistic clarity. As James R. White explains in the King James Only Controversy, the Septuagint was used over the Masoretic text, where the reading found in it supported traditional Christian doctrine, more so than the reading found in the Masoretic text. That's not speculation, it's documented practice. The translators deliberately leaned on the Septuagint when it better served Christian theology. As we can see, the presence of Septuagint renderings in the King James Bible is easily explained. It was used as source material by the KJV translators. That alone dismantles the argument for supposed divine insight in 2 Nephi 7 and 12. These aren't prophetic revelations. They're echoes from 17th century Bible compilation. But it gets worse when we turn to 2 Nephi 19 verse 1. Apologists often claim that 2 Nephi 19:1, paralleling Isaiah 9:1, aligns more closely with the Masoretic text or the Dead Sea Scrolls than the King James Version. That claim doesn't hold water. In reality, 2 Nephi 19:1 contains a glaring deviation. It replaces the way of the sea with the way of the Red Sea. This is not supported by the Masoretic text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Septuagint. No ancient manuscript reads this way. It's an unmistakable alteration, and not a subtle one. So when we actually scrutinize the evidence, the apologetic claim completely collapses. It's not just misleading, it's flat-out false. 4. Claim. Hebrew literary structures in the Book of Mormon indicate ancient authorship. Supporters also point to the presence of Hebrew poetic forms like chiasmus, parallelism, and repetitive word structures within the Isaiah passages as further evidence that the Book of Mormon text reflects genuine Semitic literary patterns. These are described as unlikely to be the product of a 19th century farm boy without formal education in biblical languages. Some even argue that changes in the text reflect careful translation choices that mirror underlying Hebrew constructs, not English literary habits. Rebuttal. The idea that Hebrew literary forms in the Book of Mormon, like chiasmus or parallelism, prove ancient origins is a tired and shallow argument. These poetic forms aren't exclusive to Hebrew or ancient scripture. They appear across world literature, including works written before and during Joseph Smith's time. Chiasmus in particular is often subjective, with patterns forced into the text by apologists eager to find meaning. Most examples in the Book of Mormon lack the precision and symmetry required to be considered genuine. To see more on how chiasmus fail within the Book of Mormon, check out my video on it, Episode 1A, Chiasmus in the Book of Mormon. Moreover, the appeal to Smith's youth and supposed lack of education ignores that his older brother Hiram attended Dartmouth College, a school with strong theological instruction and exposure to biblical languages and commentary. The Smith family had access to ideas and writings far beyond a farm boy's imagination, including sermons and print materials that discussed literary forms and biblical translation theories circulating in New England. These were not mystical patterns from a lost civilization. They were part of Joseph's environment. 5. Claim. Joseph Smith lacked access to the DSS, LXX, or Hebrew scholarship in 1829. A recurring theme throughout these claims is that Joseph Smith had no access to the kinds of resources that would explain these textual variants or translation decisions. The Dead Sea Scrolls wouldn't be discovered until the 20th century. The Septuagint wasn't widely published or translated into English at the time, and Smith had no formal education in Hebrew or Greek during the Book of Mormon translation period. This lack of access is portrayed as further evidence that the Book of Mormon Isaiah chapters could not have been fabricated using contemporary sources. Rebuttal. The start of this claim once again falls short. John Smith, a professor at Dartmouth College, was an expert in Hebrew and released a Hebrew grammar book in 1804 that would have been available to Hiram. It is not outside of reason that Hiram could have shared such things with a young Joseph to influence the Book of Mormon. It's true that the Septuagint wasn't widely available in cheap or popular editions in 1829, but it's false to suggest that no one in Joseph Smith's environment could have been exposed to its contents or influence. That kind of nuance matters when apologists try to argue supernatural knowledge. Dartmouth College in the early 1800s had a curriculum that included studies in Greek and Hebrew. For instance, a commencement program from 1786 featured orations and debates in these languages, indicating a strong emphasis on classical studies. Given that Hiram Smith attended Dartmouth College, it's plausible that he encountered discussions or materials related to the Septuagint during his studies. Apologists, including Seth, claim the Book of Mormon aligns with ancient Isaiah texts like the Dead Sea Scrolls and Septuagint, texts supposedly unknown to Joseph Smith. But historical evidence shows Smith had access to biblical commentaries, translations, and educated family members like Hiram who studied at Dartmouth. When examined closely, these miraculous alignments vanish, and anachronisms, like Deutero-Isaiah appearing before the exile, expose the Book of Mormon's modern origin. Thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon informant signing off for today.